All right, we're ready for our next talk, and we are very honored to have the ex-Minister of Defense for Canada, a peace activist. Help me welcome the Honorable Paul Hellyer.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alejandro. Reminds me of the small boy who fell headfirst into a barrel of molasses. And when they pulled him out, he licked some of the molasses from his face and said, "Lord, make my tongue adequate to this occasion." Now, that's probably the last giggle you'll hear for the next hour, because what I'm talking about is a very serious subject, in my opinion. I am not a ufologist, and I don't pretend to be, but I must say that I've enjoyed listening to so many excellent presenters the last few days and have learned a tremendous amount from them. And I'm very grateful to each and every one of them. I have made it clear, and this was accepted by open minds, that what I would do is, instead of talking specifically about the subject at hand, although it comes into my speech in context of what I want to say, that I would do a condensation of my book, which is really a sort of a worldview, a review of what is going on globally. And I've changed the subject of my speech from global turmoil, or world turmoil, to a global fraud, global hope. And mostly I'll be talking about the world financial system, which incidentally is the one subject that is less understood than the UFO phenomenon. I don't think it could get 1,000 people in the United States to come and hear about the financial situation, but I hope maybe we can stir up enough interest that the next time we can. But the world financial system is a total fraud. Fraud. It is one gargantuan Ponzi scheme, no better than the one Bernie Madoff used to swindle his friends and neighbors, and thousands of times worse if you add up the total number of victims it has ripped off over countless generations. The principal difference between the two schemes is that Madoff was acting outside the law, while the international banking cartel has persuaded generation after generation of monarchs, presidents, and prime ministers to provide legislative protection for their larceny. The bank's Ponzi scheme is very simple. They lend the same money to several people or institutions at the same time and collect interest from each one of them. It's nice work if you can get it, and you can get it if you have a bank charter. What the banks really lend, however, is their credit. And what they take back in compensation for that privilege is a debt that must be repaid with interest. The number of times that they lend the same money is called leverage. The practice is as old as the hills. But for our purposes, we can start with the goldsmiths of Lombard Street in London, England, who accepted deposits from their customers, and they issued certificates that were redeemable on demand. They paid their customers a nominal fee for the nominal interest rate on the deposits, on the understanding that they could lend the money to their customers at higher interest rates. They soon found that they could lend more than they had in their vaults because only a few depositors came in to redeem their gold or silver at any one time. It was a scam. It was illegal. Nevertheless, they got away with it for a long while, and the scam was legitimized when the Bank of England was chartered to help King William finance his war. Rich people subscribed £1,200,000 in gold and silver for the capital to establish the bank, and this was lent to the government at 8%, which is a pretty high rate of interest for a guaranteed loan. But then, to show his appreciation, the king allowed the bank to print £1,200,000 in banknotes and lend it at high interest to their friends. In effect, the bank was allowed to lend the same money twice, once to the government and once to the people. Over the years, due to the avarice of the banks and the collusion of politicians, that ratio has increased dramatically. In the early days of the 20th century, for example, federally chartered banks in the United States were required to keep a 25% gold deposit, gold backing for their deposits, and in effect, they were allowed to lend the same money 4 times. When I was younger, Canadian banks were required to keep a reserve of 8% cash, which allowed them to lend the same money 12.5 times. Today, thanks to Milton Friedman's irrational flip-flop from being a proponent of 100% cash reserves to the opposite extreme of zero reserves, and the adoption of his ideas by the major central banks of the world in 1974, multiples have increased dramatically, in some cases to as much as 20 to 1 or more. Banks only keep enough cash to meet day-to-day demands for those few customers who go in and request it. And consequently, the fraud is virtually total. The system works this way. Let's say you want to borrow $35,000 to buy a car. You go and see your friendly banker, and he or she will ask you for some collateral, some stocks or bonds, or second mortgage on your house or your cottage, or failing that, maybe the signature of a rich relative or a friend. And once the collateral is satisfied, they will ask you to sign a note for the principal plus interest, probably prime plus, so much, depending on the color of your eyes. And then they tap their computer, and presto, $35,000 appears in your account that you can go out and spend to buy the car. Seconds earlier, that money did not exist. It was created out of thin air, so to speak. Well, when the banking the way the banks make their money is what they call the spread. If you leave the money there for a while until maybe the new models come out or something like that, they'll pay you 0 or maybe 0.25% interest on it compared to the high interest rate on your note. And they make their money on the difference. The banking equation is a species of double-entry bookkeeping, where your note becomes an asset on the bank's books, and the new money that was deposited to your account is a liability. At some point, however, you have to pay back your note. You have to pay it off, plus the interest that's outstanding. And not only that, but everyone else who has borrowed from the banks, including governments, which, by the way, own the right to print money, but have irresponsibly, in my opinion, handed the right over to an elite group of private bankers. Anyone who defaults is in trouble big trouble. Individuals who default will have the assets they pledged as collateral seized by the banks. Governments that are in danger of defaulting will be forced to borrow from the International Monetary Fund, which will then tell that government how to run its affairs, including cutting back on services and selling off public assets to the international vulture capitalists. In reality, then, the banks have turned the world into one humongous pawn shop. You hawk your stocks, bonds, house, business, rich mother-in-law, or country, and the banks will give you a loan based on the value of the collateral. A world system where all the money is created as debt is a perpetual disaster in the making. It is like a giant balloon that the banks keep blowing up and filling with debt until it gets so full that we can no longer carry the debt load. And then it's like a balloon with a pin stuck in it. The system crashes, and thousands and sometimes millions of innocent people lose their jobs, homes, farms, and businesses. Almost any high school student should be able to see that any monetary system based on debt creation is totally insane. The total world debt, mathematically, is always tending toward infinity. And there is no possible way of paying it off. The real money, that is legal tender, to pay it off just doesn't exist. And the real economy, Main Street, that depends on cash to grow, shifts into low gear whenever the supply of credit money dries up. Not surprisingly, there have been 25 recessions and depressions in the United States since 1890. In several cases, including the Great Depression of the 1930s, which I remember well, and the current Great Recession, the evidence indicates that the meltdown was anticipated by a few insiders who helped trigger the catastrophe. In the wake of the Great Depression, the U.S. Senate Banking and Currency Committee report, that became widely known as the Corso report, indicated that there were insiders who benefited from the crash. And I quote, "Legal chicanery and pitch darkness were the bankers' stoutest allies," Pecora wrote in his memoir. Similar allegations were evident in Charles Ferguson's damning documentary Inside Job, relating to the 2007-2008 meltdown. And if any of you haven't seen Inside Job and you can get a look at it, I would urge you to do so. These reports